Argentines, today is a historic day for our country. After decades of failures, impoverishment, decadence and anomie, today we formally begin the path of reconstruction. Since we took office, just 8 business days ago, we have been focused on trying to contain the enormous crisis we inherited, for which we designed a shock stabilization plan that includes a fiscal adjustment plan, an exchange rate policy that brought the exchange rate to market value, and a monetary policy that includes the sanitation of the central bank. We are doing our utmost to try to reduce the tragic effects of what may be the worst crisis in our history, the product of decades of governments that have insisted on failed recipes. Because, as we have said during all these months, the problem is not the chef, but the recipe. These ideas that failed in Argentina are the same ideas that have failed throughout the planet. Because wherever they have been attempted, they have been an economic failure, they have been a social failure, they have been a cultural failure, and they have cost the lives of millions of human beings. This doctrine, which some might call leftism, socialism, fascism, communism, and which we like to classify as collectivism, is a way of thinking that dilutes the individual in favor of the power of the state. It is the basic foundation of the caste model. It is a doctrine of thought that starts from the premise that the reason of state is more important than the individuals that make up the nation, that the individual is only recognized if he submits to the state, and that, therefore, citizens owe allegiance to its representatives, the political caste. That is to say, that individuals are nothing more than a means to the ends of the state. It is a way of seeing the world that consists of the belief that a group of men, the politicians, are superior to the rest of the individuals and that therefore they should be the ones to govern the destinies of their compatriots. A doctrine that is based on the idea that a group of bureaucrats, sitting in an office, can plan the lives of millions of human beings, considering their desires, capacities, preferences and circumstances. It is a doctrine that considers that politicians, consequently, are omnipresent, omniscient and omnipotent. That is, that in essence it is a doctrine that considers that politicians are God. Well, we have come to tell you that politicians are not only not God, but that they are the cause of our problems. They are the cause of our problems because for decades they have defended these impoverishing ideas that we speak of, while they became increasingly richer. Because it is the ruthless implementation of these ideas for more than 100 years, which led us little by little, step by step, to the economic hell that we live in today. The process has been gradual, and along the way we have become accustomed to and taken as normal state interferences that are the cause of our problems. The result is the country we received, the worst inheritance in history. A country with a consolidated deficit of 15% of GDP, where 5% of the deficit is from the Treasury and 10% from the central bank. A country that spends so much that it cannot pay for it even with the highest white tax pressure in the world. A country without reserves in the central bank and with its credit confidence destroyed. A country that has issued money for 20 points of GDP to finance this public spending, and that now, as a result of this unbridled issuance, faces its worst crisis in 40 years. A country that was on its way to crashing against an annual inflation of 15,000%, and that requires an urgent change of course to avoid disaster. That change begins today. A central aspect of the failure of the last 100 years is the interference that the state has had in the lives of citizens. From this belief that politicians are superior beings who must govern the destinies of each one of us, an institutional framework emerges that makes it impossible for anyone to work, trade, travel or be educated without their permission, while in a free society everything is permitted, except what is prohibited. In a collectivist society like Argentina, everything is prohibited, except what is permitted by politicians, in clear opposition to the spirit of our liberal constitution, which sought to restrict the arbitrary power of the state in defense of the life, liberty and property of individuals. During the last 100 years, politicians have been busy expanding the power of the state to the detriment of good Argentines. This expansion of the state has been accompanied by the greatest destruction of wealth in a country on record. Our country, which at the beginning of the 20th century was the world's leading power, has been caught up in an endless cycle of crises over the last 100 years, all of which have the same origin: the fiscal deficit. In fact, in 113 of the last 123 years, we have had a fiscal deficit, and of the 22 crises that Argentines have suffered in our history, 20 have had a fiscal origin. But since the political class has never wanted to attack the cause of our problems, they have systematically resorted to debt, money emission or tax increases to alleviate this deficit. The consequence of these decisions is that Argentina is the world's biggest serial defaulter. We have removed 13 zeros from the currency, we have destroyed 5 monetary signs. We have had 2 hyperinflations without wars, and we have the highest white tax pressure in the world. What must be understood is that the problem is the deficit, and that the solutions that politicians resort to, far from solving the problem, make it worse. The use of debt as a mechanism to finance the deficit, the inevitable default, produces an increase in country risk, a rise in the interest rate, a fall in investment and, finally, miserable real wages. As has already been demonstrated theoretically and empirically, monetary emission is the only cause of inflation, which is a hidden regressive tax that hinders the price signal, destroys investment and the purchasing power of Argentines. The indiscriminate and continuous increase in taxes violates the property rights of Argentines, savings, investment, and consequently also generates miserable real wages. To solve the problems caused by the various politicians who try to finance the deficit instead of facing the cause, which is the fiscal deficit, politicians introduce regulations, price controls, restrictions, bureaucratic and normative obstacles, which violate the freedom and property rights of Argentines, hinder economic calculation and destroy the generation of wealth. Consequently, the state, as a whole, has become a machine to prevent trade, work, production, savings, investment, wealth generation, economic growth and, fundamentally, freedom. The consequence of this is that Argentina is a country where 50% of the population is below the poverty line. More than 10% of the population is destitute in a country that produces food for 400 million human beings, with a tax pressure on the agricultural sector of 70%, and the state keeps the food of 280 million human beings, and there are 5 million Argentines who do not have enough to eat. Private employment has been stagnant at 6 million jobs for more than a decade. The GDP per capita is 15% lower than in 2011. A third of formal workers are poor. In addition, we have a low unemployment rate, but it is explained by precarious employment and miserable real wages, and 6 out of 10 children, between 0 and 14 years old, are poor. I want to pause for a second on this figure that you have just heard. 6 out of 10 children between 0 and 14 years old are poor. This is the tragedy that we are experiencing, the product of a political and economic model that threatens freedom. Nothing is more important than reversing this tragic trend, which jeopardizes our future, and that is why we focus on the importance of human capital as the engine of economic growth. Well, today, we are taking the first step to end the model of decadence. Today, I have signed a decree of necessity and urgency, DNU, to begin to unblock this oppressive legal and institutional framework that has destroyed our country. As our economic model, unlike everything that has been done in the last 100 years, attacks the deficit that is the cause of our problems and not the consequences of it, we can begin today. To unblock all these regulations that claim to provide solutions but only generate problems. The decree of necessity and urgency that we are presenting today aims to begin the process of economic regulation that Argentina so badly needs in order to begin to grow. Among many reforms, the decree includes 1. Repeal of the rental law so that the real estate market can function again without problems and renting is not an odyssey. 2. Repeal of the supply law so that the state never again violates the property rights of individuals. 3. Repeal of the gondola law so that the state stops interfering in the decisions of Argentine merchants. 4. Repeal of the national purchase law, which only benefits certain actors in power. 5. Repeal of the price observatory of the Ministry of Economy, to avoid any persecution of companies. 6. Repeal of the law of industrial promotion. 7. Repeal of the law of commercial promotion. 8. Repeal of the regulations that prevent the privatization of public companies. 9. Repeal of the state companies regime. 10. Transformation of all state companies into public limited companies for their subsequent privatization. 11. Modernization of the labor regime to facilitate the process of generating genuine employment. 12. Reform of the customs code to facilitate international trade. From today, prohibiting exports is prohibited. 13. Repeal of the land law to promote investments. 14. Modification of the fire law. 15. Repeal of the obligations of sugar mills, which they have in matters of sugar production. 16. Liberation of the legal regime applicable to the wine sector. 17. Repeal of the national mining trade system and the mining information bank. 18. Authorization for the transfer of the total or partial share package of Aerolíneas Argentinas. 19. Implementation of the open skies policy. 20. Modification of the Civil and Commercial Code to reinforce the principle of contractual freedom between the parties. 21. Modification of the Civil and Commercial Code to guarantee that obligations contracted in foreign currency must be paid in the agreed currency. 22. Modification of the regulatory framework for prepaid medicine and Social Security. 23. Elimination of price restrictions for the prepaid industry. 24. Incorporation of prepaid medicine companies into the Social Security system. 25. Reestablishment of the electronic prescription to speed up the service and minimize costs. 26. Modifications to the pharmaceutical company system to promote competition and reduce costs. 27. Modification of the companies law so that football clubs can become public limited companies, if they so wish. 28. Deregulation of satellite internet services to allow the entry of companies, such as Starlink. 29. Deregulation of the tourism sector by eliminating the monopoly of tourism agencies. 30. Incorporation of digital tools for procedures of the motor vehicle registry. These reforms, of which I have only mentioned 30, of the more than 300 included, are some of the reforms that are contemplated in the DNU, which we signed today. The objective is to begin the path of reconstruction of our country, to return freedom and autonomy to individuals and to begin to dismantle the enormous amount of regulations that have prevented, hindered and stopped economic growth in our country. But this is only the first step, because in the next few days we will call for extraordinary sessions of the National Congress and send a package of laws asking Congress to collaborate in moving forward in this process of changes, which society chose, in a context of crisis which requires immediate action. The deputies and senators of the nation will face the historic responsibility of choosing between being part of this change or obstructing the most ambitious reform project of the last 40 years in order to finally achieve the productive forces of Argentines and begin to travel the road to becoming a world power again. I trust that our representatives will defend the interests of Argentines and not those of the castes, who have benefited for decades from this impoverishing system. If we advance on this path and do so with determination and forcefulness, I am sure that our country will return to the path of growth and progress that we once knew how to travel. Therefore, I want to thank you. May God bless the Argentines and may the forces of heaven be with us.
Muchas gracias.